challenge you mentally there. Very good. So they'll ask you a few questions there. Come closer, please, guys. Come closer. Nashua. Come closer. Or should I?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to check quickly which presentation this is. And whether I've got the things in here that I... Do you know, I'll just stick with this one. Actually, this is fine. Thanks. I'm going to try and talk through a couple of things. First of all, introduce myself. I've been working for the Australian Christian Lobby for a couple of years as their Director of Research. When I first joined a couple of years ago, they said, oh look, we've got this new Safe Schools program, do you want to write a report on it? So I'd done some reading in feminism when I was an undergraduate at university many years ago, and when I came to look at it now, I thought, oh yes, I understand all about gender, and then I had to sort of, scrunch my head around, and I couldn't work out what they'd done with it. So what has happened in the meanwhile is queer theory. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the history of thinking, how we have, as a culture, as a civilization, thought about the differences between men and women as an introduction to how we're thinking about it now, just so that you can put these things in context. So here are some quotes from Aristotle about what did the ancient Greeks think about women, and this is from Aristotle. He thought women were more mischievous, less simple, more impulsive, more compassionate, more easily moved to tears, more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and strike, more prone to despondency and less hopeful, more void of shame or self-respect, more false of speech, more deceptive, more retentive of memory, and more wakeful, more shrinking, and more difficult to rouse to action than men. So the Greek view of women is basically that they are defective men. Naturally inferior, it is a good thing for men to be in charge because men are the natural rulers and women are better than slaves, but are not really designed to be in a position of authority. It's for the common good that men should rule. And this is what I give to students, and they normally laugh at that because, of course, we have quite a different view, and we have this different view because of the Bible, because the Bible says that male and female is a deliberate act of creation. God did this on purpose. And really the thing that annoys me about feminism is that we're not really getting to, but why? And let's explore that, and what should that look like? How do we work with the design that God put in place? Because this design promises good things for us, I think. So it says in Genesis 1:27 that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So the interesting thing that this gives us is that women and men are equally image bearers of God. Women are spiritual equals of men. The prayers of women are just as effective. The salvation of women is just as important. And this is a kind of spiritual equality which you see throughout Christian history. I did the Middle Ages, which most feminists would say was a sort of bastion of patriarchal oppression, and that's not at all the case. So that's just to show you that the Christian heritage says that women are not deficient men. Men and women have this spiritual equality. And that changes the way we think about history. This is Mary Wollstonecraft, who's often called the mother of feminism. She was living at the end of in the period of the French Revolution is when she was writing. And one of the theses about men and women then that was going around was that the differences that we observe in men and women are all biologically driven. So the fact that women faint and have fits of the nerves and are more emotional, well, that's all because their nerves are made differently. So this was when they were just discovering nerves and optics. This is the period of Newton. And you've heard of the term highly some women are highly strung. That's a kind of linguistic memory of what they thought in this period, that women's nerves were just more tightly stretched than men's. And that made them more susceptible to moral truth and more susceptible to beauty and more inclined to be artistic and musical and all of this sort of thing. But it meant that they were a bit weak and vulnerable and not really fit for everyday life. They weren't as robust as men. And Mary Wollstonecraft, because she's called the mother of feminism, because she said, do you know all the things that we observe about women? They're not all destined from biology. We can change some of those things. If women just put down the silly novels and stop having fits of the vapours and get themselves a sensible education and learn to be different. So she was saying, we've got this tyranny of female manners. Basically what she's saying is there's a stereotype and women are trained to perform according to that stereotype. Some of that is culturally driven and we can get rid of it. So we've got this, I've said nature and nurture, and basically what she said was it's not all nature, some of it's nurture. And we can change that. The things that are nurture, we can change. And basically the history of feminism is then an exploration of how far you can take that basic premise. I won't go through all of these, but Simone de Beauvoir is another interesting person just to touch on as we go through. So she was a very significant feminist thinker. And she only died in 1986, so she has quite a long career. But basically, she wrote The Second Sex in 1949. And the premise of that was that if we look back through history and we don't see women reflected equally in the cultural achievements, you know, Virginia Woolf before this had said, women did not write Shakespeare. We look back through history and we don't see role models for women because they haven't achieved the cultural heights. And the reason that Simone de Beauvoir said, her explanation for this was that women had been kept in an inferior position. And she was saying, you're not born a genius, you become a genius. And the social conditions in which women have lived have prevented that becoming a genius for women. So you are not born inferior, you become inferior. And her thesis was interesting because what she said is we have a culture that is based on a male norm in which views women as other. So if you have, men don't need any explanation, everyone knows what men are, but then we explain women by reference to men. And it's interesting because if you think about it in the long scheme of things, what she's objecting to is this kind of Greek inheritance that says women are inferior men. And I think she's right to object to that because it's not what we believe as Christians. But she sets up this paradigm where we think of what's normal for society and women are the other. And if you listen to the LGBT rights movement, that's exactly how they say the world is set up now. The world is set up according to heteronormative norms. We regard heterosexuality as normal, we regard gender congruence as normal, which means that transgender people and homosexual people are the other. So we've got a cultural norm that privileges this, and anything that deviates from that is less good or less normal. Does that make sense? So this principle that Simone de Beauvoir set up from feminist thought has been translated through into LGBT thought now. I'm going to skip through some of this. This is the history of sex reassignment surgery, which I'll talk to doctors about later. Oh, I'll tell you about Judith Butler, though. So when you get to people like Germaine Greer, who wrote The Female Eunuch, one of the things that she was objecting to is woman is not a defective man. So she was picking up that same thought that Simone de Beauvoir had had. And when we get to Judith Butler, she was looking particularly at queer studies, which studied how homosexual relationships work. So when I was an undergraduate, we had women's studies programs that were just coming online where people were re-examining history and all sorts of things from the point of view of a feminist perspective. We were putting on our feminist lenses and looking at these things. And they hadn't really been studied before, so it was quite interesting. And one of the things that hadn't been studied was these kind of homosexual subcultures. So this is where queer studies comes from, is let's have a look at the experiences of queer people, these subcultures that don't get studied very much. And so one of the best ways of explaining queer theory is that she noticed that if you have a homosexual couple, a male homosexual couple, that one of them is often calls themselves the wife. So they are performing a female role, and that often means that they are the sexually receptive partner, that they are submissive, they might do the domestic work, they're fulfilling what is a female role, but it has nothing to do with their body. And she was very interested in this because she was saying there's a sort of gender, I need to explain gender. The way that feminism conceived of gender was the set of expectations that society had about women. So if we go back to Mary Wollstonecraft, she was saying, woman has a body, and you've attributed all sorts of things to that body. You've said that that means that women are highly strung and they're going to have fits of the nerves and they're going to be more emotional. Well, that's all a stereotype. We can break that down. But they didn't use the word gender, but sex and gender were used interchangeably until around about Simone de Beauvoir's period, when John Money said, no, gender is how you feel about yourself. It's whether or not you feel that you are a man or a woman. So it's not the stereotypes that society imposes, it's how feminine or masculine you feel. So that comes from John Money. And then we have Judith Butler saying, well, maybe gender, this idea of a gender identity, varies independently from the body. So now we're not looking at the stereotypes that a society applies to women and to men as biological classes. We're saying this man is performing a female role, and that varies independently from his body. Does that make sense as well? If it doesn't, it's because it's really woolly thinking. It's very strange, but this is basically how they came to the understanding that, or the transition from looking at gender as stereotypes, gender stereotypes that apply to men and women separately, to this understanding of gender as an internal perception of whether you feel male or whether you feel female. And that separation of gender identity in your head from your body changes everything, because until then you had girls who could do, and this is really what the feminists were aiming for. They were saying, just because you have a girl's body doesn't mean that you can't fix trucks or like playing with cars. You should be a girl and girls should be able to do whatever they like. And I completely agree with that. I think that's a very sensible way to go about parenting. Just because you're a girl doesn't mean that you have to wear pink dresses and play with dolls. If you don't like doing those things, you're still a girl. But what gender identity, this understanding of gender identity does then is it says, if you like, that gender is who you really are. It's your subjective sense of being a man or a woman. That means that what we have now, and the way they've applied this to children, is if you're a child who enjoys playing with trucks, well, that may be that your gender identity is a masculine gender identity. That may be that really who you are in your head is a boy. And that completely undoes feminism. So this, because instead of saying, no, those gender stereotypes should mean nothing, all it does is say those gender stereotypes, they're the most important thing, because now if you are performing a gender role, that means you are a man. So this is Judith Butler's theory of performativity. If you're performing a masculine role, you are a man. If you're performing a feminine role, you are a woman. If you have masculine interests, then you are a man in your head. So that these two things are connected, and it's your gender identity, it's got nothing to do with your body. I'm not explaining that very well, am I? I can see all these blank faces. Does everyone? If you think this is crazy, you're right. I disagree with Judith Butler, absolutely, but this is her theory. It's postmodernist, deconstructionist, and basically it's based on the premise that there isn't any truth. We can make it all up. And just because we always thought women were women and men were men, that we can change that if we just agree that we can be different. So one of the things that she's saying is gender oppression, gender stereotypes are oppressive, because it tells women, or people with female bodies, that they are women, and people with male bodies that they are men and they must behave in certain ways. And this is oppressive to everybody. This is a heteronormative oppression that we've all come to believe, but actually we can just decide that we don't believe that anymore, and we can smash up the gender binary. And that was really what she wanted to do. She called it, let's all be gender outlaws so that no one can tell what we are, and that will be liberating for everybody. So a lot of feminists followed this, and they thought that sounds like a great idea, because then, you know, we're not conforming to feminine stereotypes. We want to smash up the stereotypes. That sounds really good. But actually, in practice, it does the opposite of what it says on the tin, because it says, if you perform a feminine role, then you are a woman. And of course, then the transgender rights people thought that this was marvellous, because there were a lot of adult men who had always felt like they were women. And now they were saying, that's true, I actually am a woman. If gender now has nothing to do with the body, then a man can be a woman if he says he's a woman. The radical feminists disagree with this. Like the old guard, Germaine Greer, for example, she falls foul of the transgender rights movement because she says, no, a woman is somebody with a female body. We have a different experience of life, we have a different socialisation, women's oppression is located in their reproductive vulnerability, that doesn't apply to people that do not have female bodies. That's the radical feminist position. The liberal feminist position is that it's all socially constructed and the body means nothing. The reason that they want to do that is because they want to say that all the differences between men and women are the result of sexism. I will explain this actually, why the liberal feminists are agreeing with the transgender rights people. So the liberal feminists want to say biology equals zero. Biology doesn't matter. The differences between men and women, even if they're there, they're insignificant. They don't mean anything. And the reason they want to do that is because then we can come along and we can measure the different life outcomes for men and women. We can say, look, women have lower wages than men, or women have they're disproportionately represented in different professions. Well, all of that is the operation of sexism. And we can change it, because if biology equals zero, then if there's no difference between men and women at birth and yet life outcomes are very different, well then that's evidence of sexism somewhere in the machine. So we need to sort of go back through the sausage machine and work out where that sexism is, and basically re-educate our children and say boys are no different to girls. Now, that was coming online when I was an undergraduate, and I remember thinking, oh, okay, it's all nurture, none of it's nature. And then I had children, and I thought, well, I didn't train these boys to be like that. I don't want them running around with sticks. You know, I want them to sit down quietly in a cafe and finish their coffee. But, you know, and I used to look around at these other children that were sitting in cafes. How do those parents manage to get their kids to sit still? And then I realised that they'd normally had girls. So it's not that boys live in this box and girls live in that box, but it's definitely, I have observed a difference that boys seem to be different to girls on a sort of population level, and there are certainly some things that my sons were doing which were not the result of a gender affirmation, because I did not want them to be doing those things. So when I had children, I remember saying to a friend of mine, I was told it was all nurture. Well, that's complete guff, isn't it? Because, you know, whoever thought that had not observed small children or didn't have children of their own. And this friend of mine said, well, you know, they're still teaching that in universities. And I thought, get out of here, no way, because it's crazy. It's obviously not true. It seemed that way to me. Anyway, but it's not just that they're still teaching it. The radical feminists have gone completely to the extreme to say that nature equals zero, biology equals zero, the body doesn't matter, everything is a social construct. So if everything's a social construct, then the body doesn't matter, well then biological men can be women if they believe that they're women. So do you see how the idea of gender as varying independently from the body has sort of merged in this queer theory? So it's a radical reconstruction of how we think about people. I'm going to try and find, that's right, so just to quickly touch base with, this is what they're now teaching children in schools. It's based on queer theory, but this is the gender-bred person, and they're told that instead of, you know, boys are boys, and boys can do whatever they like and still be boys, girls can play with trucks and still be girls. Now what they're told is that there's 5 in this case, different parts of you, and they all vary independently. So there's your gender identity, which is whether or not you feel male or female inside your head. And these are all, none of them's binary. It's not male or female. There's a spectrum. You could be somewhere in between. You could be both. You could be neither. It's just somewhere on that spectrum between male and female. You need to work out where you fit in your head. You might feel a bit less like a woman than that person. How do we know? But anyway. And then there's gender expression, how you like to express your gender in terms of whether, again, it's on a spectrum. Some people are more girly, some people are more masculine, so somewhere between, you know, really butch and really feminine, that's gender expression. Then there's biological sex, and they like to say that that varies as well on a spectrum, and so suddenly they've come up with intersex people as the evidence that this is a spectrum as well, so even biology is not binary. Biology is a bit sticky because clearly there are XY chromosomes and XY, you know, and most people fit into a male or female category, so that's a bit inconvenient. And then there's sexual attraction that ranges again on a spectrum between homosexual and heterosexual, and romantic attractions are viewed separately. So this was being used in a New South Wales curriculum. The Safe Schools curriculums are a lot less visually appealing than this, but they basically explain the human person as being made up of these separate parts, and they all vary, they're all on a spectrum, and they all vary independently. They've updated the gender-bred person in America because basically it was accused of propping up the patriarchy. it's a gender-bred man, let's face it. So they said, no, we're going to reconceive the human person without reference to gender or biology at all. So now we have the gender unicorn. And gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, emotional attraction, and you'll notice that they say sex assigned at birth. So we're really trying to downplay the evidence that men and women are different and that that's written into our biology at all. Do you see how this is just radically different to where we started before Mary Wollstonecraft, where everything was biologically driven? Now nothing at all is biologically driven. So what does gender look like now? Well, we were thinking about, there's a spectrum somewhere between male and female, and maybe, this is another way that we can think about it. This is how transgender people think about it, that, there are some people that are just men born into women's bodies and women born into men's bodies. Mostly they align, but sometimes they don't. But the problem with this is that it's still binary. And if we're going to be really postmodernist about it, we can't have a binary. That's not how we like to think about things. So you get people saying, well, I'm kind of a boy, but if you draw a line between male and female, I'm kind of in the middle, but off one side, an inch to the right. What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, this is how we think about it now. So we've got male and female here, but we've got agender and gender fluid, and it's all mushroomed out. The way an activist website described it recently was, gender is like a galaxy you can explore, but you can never understand it. So there's infinite possibilities, you can recreate yourself. And so another website shows it like this: gender isn't really like this. No, that's how we always thought of it, but it's more like this. It's what you're interested in, it's how you feel. Oh, that's the Safe Schools version, but it's basically, gender isn't quite as simple as whether you're male or female. Everyone has their own gender identity in relation to masculinity and femininity. Some identify with both and some don't identify with either. It's up to the individual to describe which gender fits them best. Here are some examples from Tumblr. Tumblr is a sort of oracle website that teenagers come to understand the new way of thinking about gender. And it's got lots of different genders. Some of them are quite funny, but these are my favourites. We've got things like glass gender, which is a gender that is very sensitive and fragile. We've got love gender, which is a gender defined by love for other gendered people who are treated badly, and a love for your own gender as well. Or mirror gender, a gender that changes to fit the people that you're around. So these aren't really genders anymore. They're nothing to do with male and female, so why should it be called gender? This is just identity, but it's being called gender identity. And one of the things that I think is, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that for teenagers who are introduced to this, they're being told, you need to work out who you are. That's the job of teenagers. Who am I? Yeah, I'm different from my parents, but who am I? What makes me unique and special and interesting and different? And so they're being told, well, here's a recipe. You just need to find out who you are by sort of working out on these different spectra, where you are. Or you might be one of these things, and they've got, 73 different genders, and they're making up new ones all the time. So here's somebody who's trying to work out their gender, and it says, I need some help. My gender feels like something big and untamed, like a wild horse. Is there any gender that fits? And what would be some nice pronouns? I was thinking about wilds, self, or horse self, but they sound too silly. Thank you for your help. And then Tumblr writes back saying, oh, look, here are some genders that might fit you. We've got Jupiter gender, which is a gender that is so large and present that one is not quite sure what it is because it's too big to see clearly, and it's definitely there, but no one knows that they're definitely not cisgender. Now, cisgender is the word that says that you feel like a man and you are a man. So you're something other than that, but you can't really quite work it out. Or there's gigagender, which is a very big gender that is indefinable and large and powerful. These are like crazy thoughts, but these are and what this is telling teenagers is everything that is unique and special and different about you, well, that's your gender. And all you need to do is find out what that gender is, and then you can sort of pour your identity into this vessel, which is your gender, and it has these pronouns. And the thing that's really difficult then is that for kids who have been told that's who you really are, and then somebody doesn't use your right pronouns, well, you really would feel like you were being annihilated. Your whole identity was not being acknowledged. Because when I first read this, I thought, oh, come on, self-indulgent teenagers, cut your hair and get a job. But listening to all of how this was landing with kids, I was realising that all the way through they were being told, and you're valid, this is your identity, and that's valid. You need other people to recognise that you're valid. And I was thinking, valid is such a terrible thing, to be kind of grasping upwards at validity. It's such a... It's so below the truth. The truth is that we are infinitely precious and special and wonderful and loved by God and purposed for good. And when you understand the truth of who we are in God, then valid is such a terrible... Like, you're selling kids short if they think that they need to just be valid. And the fact that these kids didn't even feel valid just broke my heart. I thought, wow, that is so, so sad. We're dealing with a generation that doesn't know how special they are. So these are some of the things that it tells kids on websites, that the world is full of transphobes and homophobes. So this is another thing, tapping into how kids were feeling about this. Because if you're told you are bisexual or you are transgender, and then your parents don't acknowledge that and celebrate it, well, then they become transphobes and homophobes. And what that tells kids is those people hate transgender people. Your parents don't love you. That's really what it's saying to kids, which is a heartless thing to say to kids. But there's all of these little messages that come from their so-called friends on Tumblr. Please love your transgender children and non-binary children. They aren't hurting anyone, and they're normal, and they deserve your love. That's all we want. So what this says is, love looks like affirmation of this gender nonsense. If you disagree with the queer theory agenda, then you are not loving your children. And the thing is, we can hear that as adults and go, oh, well, that's nonsense, we disagree with it. But when the kids believe it, it's really, really hurtful to them, and it helps to alienate them from their children. And I've spoken to parents here in Melbourne, in Western Australia, who have experienced this. On the other hand, the queer community, they're saying, but we love you, you're one of us, you're a queer person, come here to the party because it's so much fun. We understand who you really are and we accept you unconditionally, not like your nasty homophobic, transphobic, abusive parents. It's very, it's like grooming. It's really damaging that relationship, that trust that should exist between parents and their children, and that's the trust that parents rely on to have any influence with their children. So it's very corrosive. Meanwhile, they're sort of navigating a culture where transgenderism and of all sorts, including transvestitism, is just being celebrated as normal. So this is gender diversity. You can see that these are all Safe Schools materials produced by -18, and it's being funneled through popular culture, not just here in Australia, all around the Western world. These are some articles that I got. It's aimed at a teenage market from Teen Vogue, so it wasn't even a particularly... It was a mainstream media outlet, and it's telling kids heteronormativity is a bad thing. Most people aren't straight anymore. This is why you might want to change your name, and there's all sorts of compassionate reasons why we need to understand this. We have gender dysphoria rising in children, and we have rapid onset gender dysphoria. So just to go back to this one, this is the case for people pre-puberty who felt that they were the opposite gender, and you see how these were tiny numbers all around the world, and then suddenly there's this big upswing. Well, this is already 3 years old, but now we have children presenting to gender dysphoria clinics in their thousands. I think it was 2,000 2 years ago in the UK. It was 50 kids a week all around the country presenting to gender dysphoria clinics. So this is, and meanwhile the research that says, why is this happening? Is this a good thing for our teenage kids? Well, that's being stifled. There was somebody who wanted to do some research into desisting, like people who had been through sex change surgeries who then wanted to reverse it, or at least surgically transition back, and that was defunded and protested. And this man here, Dr. Michael Bailey, his work has been protested very highly as well. He's, soldiering on bravely. But he did some research into rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is where teenagers suddenly decide that they're transgender, having never shown any indication of that previously. And he said that preliminary research indicates that young people who identify as trans out of the blue may have been influenced by social media sites that valorize being trans. In addition, researchers have observed a pattern of clusters of friends coming out together. So last month there was a report published by Brown University that showed exactly this. It had surveyed a lot of families that had transgender children, teenagers, and they all said, well, they started spending a lot of time online and there was trauma there, or a lot of different common scenarios one friend came out and then suddenly the whole group was trans. They started talking negatively about people who were cis because they weren't, you know, it wasn't cool anymore to be just boring old heteronormative. And that report came out. It was a really interesting report. I read it, and then the next day it was pulled because it was protested. So Brown University said, oh, okay, maybe we will withdraw that, but it's out there now. We've seen the research. It's interesting research, but it's very politicised. We're not allowed to talk about these things anymore. So just quickly to talk about, the latest thing is conversion therapy here in Victoria. Victoria is the worst place in Australia, I have to say. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out of Victoria, and the reason is that you have the Australian Research Centre for Sex, Health and Society here at La Trobe University, which is basically a nest of activist academics. And under the Labor government, they've been given extraordinary influence. So what they do is they have an activist agenda, and they'll talk about that for years and years, and eventually they'll produce some research that says, look, we've got the proof. They trot that along to committees in the Departments of Health and Education, where they have been given positions as advisors on committees, and they develop government policy. What should government policy be? Well, obviously it's informed by the experts from this university, and then as a result of that, the government will come up with a policy, and quite often they'll entrust La Trobe University with the implementation of that policy, and they'll fund it. So it becomes a one-stop shop, and it's all within this enclosed centre, so they have enormous influence. And if you read their annual report, it just looks like a list of accomplishments for the LGBT rights movement. It includes safe schools, the Rainbow Tick accreditation program. There's a program called the HEY Grants, H-E-Y, Healthy Empowered Youth Grants, and that's basically early career funding for the next generation of activists. Who will eventually, you know, carry on the movement. So if you just read through, it's just LGBT all the way, but they're pushing this very political agenda where we're trying to eradicate heteronormativity. They're calling it the queer revolution. Everybody's queer. If we weren't oppressed by heteronormativity, we would all naturally be queer. And the latest thing is that if anyone who declares an LGBT identity, well, that's just who they really are, isn't it? So anyone who disagrees with that or who doesn't affirm and celebrate that is guilty of conversion therapy. So this is a misuse of language again. They're very naughty with language. So that we were told that Safe Schools was an anti-bullying program, and most people hear that and they say, ah, yes, anti-bullying, that's because there are some kids who are picked on and we want to include them, we want them to be looked after. That's not what it's about at all, because from the activist point of view, heteronormativity is bullying automatically, because it makes them an other. If we have this as the norm, then LGBT are other. So they can't be included in the social order because the social order is inherently discriminatory. So we need to change the social order. So from their point of view, it's an anti-bullying program because, and we think they want inclusion in the existing social order. Actually, they want to smash up the social order. And if you listen to their narratives, it's very clear that even last year in the same-sex marriage debate, it was presented as, but there are these same-sex attracted people, they're just the same as everyone else, why shouldn't that be marriage? But if you listen to the activists, they're saying, well, why should we be made to look like heterosexual people? We're not like that. Why should we be subjected to the politics of respectability? We don't want to be included in the social order, we want to smash up the social order, and they've called it a declaration of war. So it's not to say that all same-sex attracted people are like that, absolutely not. There are a lot of homosexual people who are on our side of this debate, who don't share the politics or the worldview of these activists. But you need to sort of put on the goggles, how the activists see the worldview, to understand then the misuse of language. So if Safe Schools is an anti-bullying program because heteronormativity is bad, well then they'll start talking about abusive parents, and you find out that abusive parents are just parents who want to protect their children from this agenda. Because we would all be queer, your heteronormative parents are imposing heteronormativity on you, that's abusive. And then we have conversion therapy, which is basically anyone who doesn't affirm an LGBT identity just because it's declared. So this is the existing Labor Party platform from 2015. So if they're elected to federal government, this is what they will try to introduce in law. And it says that anyone who's guilty of conversion therapy, well, the ALP party will acknowledge these harms when suffered within the family as domestic violence against the child. So a parent who doesn't say, yes, you are transgender, here are the hormones, will be guilty of abuse, according to this. Now, just to be clear, conversion therapy refers to a very specific thing. It refers to involuntary, forced aversion therapy in an attempt to cure homosexuality. In some parts of the world, they do still have this. We haven't had it here for a very long time. No right-minded person is in favour of conversion therapy. It's actually banned by the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights under the article that deals with torture. It's not effective. It doesn't help anybody. Why would you? Nobody is arguing for conversion therapy. But what they say is, well, conversion therapy is anything that doesn't celebrate an LGBT identity. So anything short of complete affirmation is conversion therapy. That includes praying for somebody. We were looking at this, this is the draft ALP party platform. They'll take this to their conference in December and decide whether or not they want to change it. And when we were looking at this, Martin Isles, who's our managing director, was discussing it with me, and he said, well, it seems that they've changed it and they've taken parents out of it. And I said, yes, but I don't think they've made it any better. Because what it says is Labor opposes the practice of so-called conversion and reparative therapies on LGBTIQ+ people and will seek to criminalise these practices. So this is nothing short of the legal weaponry for the state to intervene in every family and the way parents parent. I've just given a talk yesterday at a ACL conference called Recruiting Children to the Queer Revolution, which is exactly, they're calling it the queer revolution, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. We want your children, because every revolution worth its salt knows that you need to get the next generation, and that's how they're planning to do it. It sounds like a terrible thing, doesn't it? But this is a really totalitarian agenda, and I think because people don't think that this can happen in a nice democratic society like Australia, that they don't really understand the dangers that are inherent in this. There's something there dealing with schools, but there's another thing that I think is interesting about this platform, and it says children can become vulnerable when their needs are considered secondary to the priorities of their parents and carers, institutions, governments, cultural and economic interests. So just because parents think differently, we know what the best interests of your children are, and children can be vulnerable when parents prioritise their own interests over the well-being of their children. All children, regardless of their background, religion, for example, should be valued, respected, and have their needs and rights recognised. So when you see this through the lens of how the activists see the world, this is how they're setting it up, so that we can say what the best interests of the child are. The best interests are to automatically transition them. And in fact, I don't think I've got them on this slide pack. No, I haven't, but there's a policy here in Victoria, I can probably tell you verbatim what it says, which is that it may be necessary if a child declares a transgender identity at school, it may be necessary for the school to transition the child without the parents' knowledge or consent and without consulting any medical doctors. So this isn't about the correct diagnosis of gender dysphoria, this is about transitioning children at all costs. I mean, and it may be possible to consider the child a mature minor. And schools are given no guidance about when that child is not a mature minor. If you look at the court records of this, there are quite a lot of children that are being considered mature minors who have autism and who are actually recognised by the courts to not be capable of making independent decisions themselves, and yet they're allowed to go through sex change surgery. So this is a political agenda that does not have the best interests of children at heart. They're pretending that that's what it's about, but it isn't. So there you are. I know, I'm sorry, looking at your face. It's horrifying. You've just had a little glimpse of my working day. I sort of walk around in the activist worldview going, oh my goodness, this is shocking stuff. So I'm just trying to sort of digest it and give you the results of a lot of reading. Does anyone have any questions or, yeah? Yeah.
How come this is actually watered
Yeah, yeah, good point. And there are so many disconnects of logic. And so if you try to rationalise your way through it, and this is what we do, we come along and we go, oh, well, that doesn't line up. But you're absolutely right, because what they say is heteronormativity privileges people whose gender identity aligns with their biology, right? And that means you're saying that trans people are not as good as other people. But Of course they think that too, because otherwise they wouldn't want to change their body. The only thing we disagree with is whether or not it's easier to change your mind or change your body. And we think that you can't change your body. So it's easier to change your mind. It's not always easy, of course. But what we're finding as well is there are different kinds of gender dysphoria. There's all sorts of different reasons for it. But quite a lot of the adult men that transition to be women, there's a man in the US called Walt Heyer who has a ministry. He's been through 2 sex change surgeries himself. He's a Christian, and he now has a ministry to people who are regretting. He has a website called Sex Change Regret. And he says that when he meets people who contact him through his website, he meets them and says, so what went wrong? Well, they can always say why they were that way. It's sometimes a childhood trauma. In 50% of cases, it's childhood sexual abuse. But sometimes it's mental comorbidities, hormonal imbalances, all sorts of different things like that. And the problem is that after they've had the sex change surgery, they're told that that will solve all their problems, and they feel good about it for a while, because when you've invested really heavily in something, you have to hope and believe that it's going to work. And then normally between about 3 years and 15 years after the sex change surgery, they regret it. And they realise that not only have the problems not been solved, but they've got a mutilated body to cope with now as well. Yep, Hay grants, yeah.
So that program which is
Ooh, that's a good segue into an ad for LMI, isn't it? Yes, we do. So there are several branches of ACL, or subsidiaries of ACL. One is the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is there to help people who are persecuted for their faith or who lose their jobs because of it. So there's that side of things, which is legal help. And then another branch is called the Lachlan Macquarie Institute. And this has been going for a number of years now. We have quite a lot of alumni, which is good. It's growing very strongly, and we're very, very blessed to have a new managing director for that, whose name is Paul Henderson, who's a very gifted teacher. He's just brilliant, lovely guy. And that there's a website, so if you Google Lachlan Macquarie Institute, you'll see that, and it has a number of programs, including 2 3-month programs, which are basically to equip Christian leaders for the future. So our previous managing director of ACL, two managing directors ago, was named Jim Wallace, and he was a senior officer in the SAS in the Army, and he left the Army to manage ACL and to really get it off the ground because he has a strategist's brain, and he realised that looking long term, we needed something like the ACL. And the LMI is again something that he started because he realised that we need to equip Christian leaders for the future. It's not good enough just to come along to our politicians and try to persuade them of our point of view. We need to be making sure that our young people who are conviction politicians who will uphold our values are getting into politics. So that's not just politics, actually, influencing culture and their professions as well. So there are lots of different courses, but we run a course for church leaders. We run courses, the internship, which is 3 months of living in community. And then there's shorter courses as well. So there's one over the summer that we run for high school leavers or university students, because what happens is a lot of kids grow up in Christian families and then they go to university where they're told, oh, well, all of that is rubbish. And so what that's to do is to give them a counter-argument to what they're being told in the world, and to understand that their faith is consistent with logic and reason, and there are really good arguments to be made against these philosophies that come against our faith. So that's called CHQ as well, and that runs over the summer. So they're all on the website, yeah, and you can apply there as well. And we have some brilliant teachers. I teach it. So, no, but they have really high-level professors and people who are Christian thinkers, but well-qualified academics in their field teaching there as well. So it's really good fun. I wouldn't be welcome in any gender studies department in any university, but I get to go and teach my version of the history of gender to LMI, and I teach on gender and sexuality, including things, the sexual revolution and the fallout of that, and pornography. So there are lots of different things that come out of the sexual revolution. So we're just understanding the basis of it. How did we end up here? and so that they can know that there is a good reason for the Christian principles that we have. They're consistent with reason. Yeah. Any other? So yeah, send people our way, because it's interesting. Not many churches know about it, but it's a really good. The other thing that's interesting about it, they do placements in Parliament, so that people find out about the political system, because quite often it's who you know, and yeah. So we actually have an LMI alumni who's a senator at the moment. So Lucy Kachui, who's from South Australia, she's an immigrant from Kenya who did the Lachlan Macquarie internship, and she was elected to the Senate as well, but by a miracle really, but it's really good to have Christians strategically positioned. Any other questions? Are you all sort of... Was any of this familiar to you, or is it all new? Heard rumours? Your teenagers will know about this stuff. My teenagers know about this stuff. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for listening. I don't think that I need to, keep you any longer, but thanks very much.
We thank Dr. Elisabeth Taylor and Mr. Dan Flynn for coming out from the ACL, and I've been following the ACL for a few years now, and getting up to date with the latest things happening around the country, and it's always very informative for me, because as a priest, we like to inform our people up to date, and mainly one of the questions they have is, if these things are happening in the schools, what are our responses? What are our rights? Can we pull our children out of this program? What do we say to our children at home? All these sort of questions we can get advice for, and also to see what's happening around the country, but especially in Victoria. It is one of the worst states in that sort of regressive ideology. And we thank you very much for enlightening us with your deep research. As you may have maybe heard from the beginning, Dr. Elisabeth Taylor is the Director of Research in ACL, so she's done a lot of her homework, and we thank her and Dan Flynn again for coming out. And Abuna will just conclude for us quickly. Father Abuna will conclude for us quickly. And thank you as servants for coming in as well. He already asked.
Oh, you already asked the questions? All done? Okay. I think.
Okay, so the Safe Schools program, it's not just the curriculum, it's, and it will look different in different schools, but the Andrews government has said that they want safe schools in all of the government schools by the end of this year, so they're rolling it out. In Christian schools, it's still fine. It doesn't mean that Christian schools won't have it, but they have the option not to have it. So really just keep an eye on your school. I think every now and then there are some odd Catholic schools that break ranks and, Some preschools, okay, right. So yeah, you need to keep an eye on them and make sure they toe the line. I was talking here down in Victoria a couple of years ago, and a principal of a Christian school came up to me afterwards and said that after Safe Schools came in, their enrolment went up by 100 students in the next 3 months. So there are a lot of refugees from the from the state system into Christian schools, the good ones. And in other places, that in America, for example, Oregon has these is very progressive, and they've had whole new schools start up just as refugees from the government school system. So at the moment, the Christian schools have the ability to opt out. And even there, I would be really careful about sexuality education, for example, because it just depends on how switched on they are to this agenda. But you always have the option of, so I would definitely ask for the curriculum so that you can have a look at what they're going to be teaching your kids. And in terms of sexuality education, no matter whether you're in the state school system or non-government school systems, you're always allowed to opt your kids out of those programs if you want to. Now, in practice, that's a bit of a problem, because what they do is they say, now, you know, young George, you're to come to the library now. And of course, everyone goes, George, how come you're not listening to this, you know? And suddenly George is the funny kid. So that is a problem for kids to manage in that way. But you have, as a parent, have the option to say, I don't want this stuff to be taught to my kids.
Not only that, but I was just talking to a teacher yesterday. She's a grade 5 teacher. And I was asking her about whether her school is, you know, involved in safe schools. I think it was Rosewood Primary School in, I think it's Rowville. Anybody heard of Rosewood in Rowville? Anyway, and she said, yes, we do. She said they incorporate safe schools throughout the whole curriculum. So you can't really pull your child out of one particular subject. They're very clever about that. So.
No, so that, I was talking about the sexuality education curriculum. You can pull them out of that, but safe schools is not, well, it is a curriculum, but they won't necessarily be teaching it. What they have there is called the whole of school approach, and that means that we're going to normalise transgenderism and homosexuality in every subject. So we have LGBTIQ History Month. Even if you teach maths, well, you can give examples of homosexual, boyfriends who need to divide up the pizza. So every subject can be just kind of drip fed. Actually, sexuality education's quite tricky. Like, how do you teach kids about puberty when boys might not have masculine body? It gets really crazy. Actually, it gets really crazy. But if a safe school is a safe school, it just means that the policy settings are all set to normalise homosexuality and transgenderism. It doesn't mean that it's all going to be done to the same extent in every school, but it means that if you have an activist teacher who really wants to push it, or a principal who really wants to push it, then they've got an open door and there's no way of stopping that. It also means that it's valorising these things. It's saying this is the enlightened, progressive, cool thing to do, which is why it's infecting teenagers. Because what happens is, you're the new non-binary cool kid, and they say, oh, it's really boring and it's so last year to be heterosexual. And so the kids who, for faith reasons, say, well, actually, I believe these things, well, they become homophobic bigots. It actually turns the tables on them so that they're isolated. And when safe schools first came in, we heard from a lot of kids who were marginalised by their communities. So they become identified as the bad guys. There's a real social cost for those kids. That's okay.
Okay, so I think we'll finish off here. I think you guys are, you're okay? Yes.
There was a policy setting on that from the ALP. They would like to financially punish schools that don't do this. At the moment, that's only in the draft policy at ALP level. They have threatened to do that in Victoria. And I know I've spoken to the principal of one Christian school who was talking to the education minister, and he said, well, if you forced me to teach this stuff in my school, I would just close the school down. And the minister said, you couldn't afford to do that because you must have loans and things, financial arrangements in place. And this particular pastor, who was also the principal of the school, said, he manages the whole thing. The school is attached to a church. And he said, that's not why we built the school. We don't have loans on it. We will close it down rather than teach that stuff. So if we have enough Christian schools that do that, then the government won't be able to do anything about it, because a third of Victorian students are educated in Christian schools or non-government schools. So as long as they all stick together, then the government, that would cause a massive financial problem for the government. They just can't possibly afford to build all of those schools and find all of those teachers. And so as long as they all stick together, then that will be okay for now. But that's definitely something that we're watching, because we know the activists want to change that. Yep.
So is this the kind of thing that we should
Yeah.
should be helping each other writing that school and try, as you said, the principal this kind of education to get through.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is there something that ACL
Yes. Yeah. We have been working. No, no. I mean, definitely talk to Dan if you have any problems like that. It's excellent because we really do need to push back on this. And Dan will tell you that principals are normally quite receptive to hearing from parents because unless you get a really hard line principal, but most of them are just going along with this because they think, oh, well, that's the compassionate thing to do. In the case of Catholic schools, they're answerable to the Catholic Education Office, and so there's some church authority that you can sometimes get if you get a word in the bishop and the bishop says no, no, then the Catholic schools have to stop it. So that's one way of working through the Catholic school system. And our South Australian director, who's also a lawyer like Dan, has developed some letters for South Australia that we can adapt for other states, which basically say, if my child identifies as transgender, I'm going to come and sue you. And we don't know if it's worked, but it's definitely worth pushing that back on them. Because there is a big movement that's happening back against this. I mentioned the word class action to a group of lawyers that I was talking to once, and they were literally rubbing their hands because this is medically reprehensible what is happening. There are a lot of parents in the UK, for example, saying, well, my children were just rushed through gender reassignment, and what have you done? Because now they've desisted. They're not transgender anymore, and what have you done? You've mutilated their bodies, we're coming for you. And if doctors, I mean, I feel for doctors because they're really in a bind here, but they need to know that this isn't just a one-way street, that there's some pushback. It will come eventually, but if we tell schools about that now, then it will cause them to think twice. But if it's a Catholic school, then normally a letter, a meeting with the principal, and then follow up with, this kind of threat of potential legal action, even going through the Catholic hierarchy. Those are all good things to do. Yeah, and definitely great that you're supporting each other with standing firm. The other thing that you can all do is join P&C of your local school, because then you have an influence. Join your professional associations as well, because a lot of the left wing have got influence because they're the ones in the local councils. They're the ones doing these good public service works, and if more Christians were doing those sorts of things, then we would have better representation at all levels. So it's really civil leadership as well.
Liz, we've worked very hard today. I won't let you go, Liz.
Ah, no, it's good. Yeah, the questions are coming now. There isn't one. No, because only the child really knows, you see. So, yeah. Oh, okay, right, yeah. So different things. You can decide before school age. So we've got preschoolers starting in the other uniform now because, so that gender fairy book that I showed you, Only the Child Really Knows, that's designed for really small children. So people are socially transitioning in primary school, before primary school, even in preschools now. There's a thing called the Dutch protocols, which is the medical guidance for the medical transitioning, and it normally starts with puberty blockers. And the age for that is coming down. It used to be 12, but now it's down 10-year-olds because they don't want you to go through puberty in the wrong body, you see, because that will cause problems. So what they do is they arrest puberty. Now, the medicine behind that is really dodgy anyway, because that's a misuse of those drugs. Basically, there's an inhibitor that stops the cascade of hormones. Most kids who have childhood gender dysphoria, at least 80% of them will desist if you just let puberty happen. So what we're doing is we're stopping puberty, and it does things that we don't know about to the brain. So it's stopping those receptors for the puberty hormones, but it's stopping other things as well. So it's actually causing massive problems that we're not really, we don't know what we're doing. We're monkeying around with an incredibly complicated system. So puberty blockers are a problem medically, but also socially, because what happens is you've arrested little Jimmy and he's staying in a little boy's body. Well, around him, everyone else is turning into a woman or a man, and he looks smaller and different now to his peers. So now what they're saying is, well, we need to give little Jimmy cross-sex hormones. And that then has problems for reproduction as well, but it changes the brain. There's all sorts of, like, it's incredible. If you understand any of the medical science about behind this, you would just think, oh my goodness, what in the world are we doing? I'm not a doctor, but I can already understand that this is not something we should be messing about with. So then there's cross-sex hormones. The age for that used to be 16, and you used to have to, if you wanted it before that, you used to have to get a family court order, which was expensive and it took time. Last year, the family court got together and said, oh, we can do away with that. So they've actually just absolved themselves of a responsibility to look after kids. Anyway, so there's some big legal questions about whether or not they can do that. They are trusted to look after kids, and they've just said, oh, we're not going to. Basically we'll leave it to the doctors. And in practice, they weren't saying no in any case, because what happens is a child who's gender dysphoric gets a little coterie of advisors, and they all trot along to the judge and they say, oh no, it's very necessary. This is look, here are all the, and the experts all say, yes, it's medically necessary. And so the judges all go, oh, well, all right, fine, I'll sign it. So it was taking about $20,000, and more importantly, it was taking time. And that then meant that, puberty was happening despite the puberty blockers sometimes, but also those kids were in distress for longer. So this is a marvellous thing, isn't it, that we can just transition them younger. So now they can start cross-sex hormones. Now those hormones are useful for particular medical illnesses, but I have a friend who's a GP who was noticing that these have not been approved for sex change purposes by the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Association. And she just noticed in an email to me, she said, so we're probably all prescribing them illegally. And I was thinking, well, let's have a look at that, shall we? Are we prescribing them illegally? Because the guidelines that doctors follow in this are well, they're written by activists now as well, so there are some guidelines, but they're all, the medical science behind them is non-existent or very dodgy. So, and even the safeguards that are there are being eroded. So last year in Ohio, there was a Christian parents who would not approve cross-sex hormones for their daughter, and the court awarded custody of the daughter to the grandparents who would. So basically parents children are being taken away from parents who don't allow this sort of thing to happen. Absolutely shocking. Yeah, sorry, another question that's good. This is the row here, isn't it? You go. Yeah. Oh yeah, good. Is there? Oh, I'm going to find out the answer.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, look, we don't have a pronoun law in Victoria yet. They do have a thing called They Day, which they run every, it's the first Wednesday of the month in a particular public service department. So it's all kind of in a laughable category at the moment. However, they have put out edicts to sporting clubs that pronouns, must be respected. So they're trying that at the very grassroots level. But at the moment we don't have a pronoun law as they do in Canada. And that led to the rise of prominence of Jordan Peterson, the non-religious gentleman who wouldn't use pronouns. So, yeah, everything Elisabeth says is very challenging. I'll bear this in mind. There is an election in Victoria in about 27 days, and Matthew Guy, who is, his mother is Orthodox, I think his father's Greek, they have a very, he's a sort of strong Orthodox origin. He is saying he will abolish safe schools and scrutinise the curriculum to get this gender fluidity out. So give that some thought. I will say this, Narre-Warren, North, South and Cranbourne, these three seats are key in the election, and we have people out this afternoon who are door knocking in this area. They're using an app that'll tell them who's receptive to the message, and so I sort of see myself every evening between now and the election, but for a Sabbath day or two, door knocking from about 4 to 7. So if you want to join us in that activity, because we want to talk to voters about this very issue, this very conversation. When we talk to people at the doors, they go, oh no, I don't agree with that, safe schools. And it's a lot of people don't understand it. When it's explained, they want to vote against it. So love your support with that. And yeah, thank you so much for having us today. And you've been very attentive audience for Dr. Elisabeth. And I want to honour your pastor, Father Abanor. I've got to get that right. I've got to say that correctly. Father is a great pastor, Father. And yeah, look after him and look after all the team. Thank you and God bless you.
You want to say that part again, Dan, about looking after me?
What was that?
You want to repeat that part again?
No, do look after him because there's so much hard work. Probably every second day, he has to go to hospital to visit, a congregation member.
I'll pay you later.
So, when you're a shepherd, there's a lot of work. So honour him. Thank you.
All right, we want to thank Elisabeth and Dan for spending most of the day with us today. They've had a conference all day yesterday, and Elisabeth joined us till about 10:30 at night last night talking to young people. So they've really put their heart and soul into this. I really, really want to thank them. Of course, the question that's on everybody's minds is, what do we do about it? And how do we tackle it as a church, as a community, as Christians? These are questions for us to all dwell on, think about, congregate, pray about it and see. We need to obviously figure a way around it, or figure a way to speak up, and figure a way to put our hands up, and figure a way to say our opinion as well. So I think I encourage each and every one of you to say your opinion out there in a respectful way. That can make a difference. We need to speak up. In the past, Christians have always been quiet, but I think it's coming to the time for us to speak our mind, to say our mind in a respectful way, without, of course you'll get some pushback, but at least we need to say our opinion and be counted that way. So on your behalf, I want to thank Dan and Elisabeth again for joining us today. Thank you for your time as well for joining us. Thank you, guys. All right. Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Kingdom, power and glory. The love of God the Father, and grace of the only begotten Son, and the gift and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you. Go in peace. The peace of the Lord be with you all. Thank you, everyone. Come and say hello. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. If you want to ask any personal questions or anything, please do.